2 hours. That is exactly how long the authorities took to close the investigation of 5 missing children. They claim the fire was an accident. They claim the bodies turned to dust. But physics says that is a lie. This is not a story about a tragedy. This is a story about a cover-up.
Christmas morning, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia. While the rest of the world was waking up to presents and peace, George and Jenny Sodder were waking up to hell. The ashes of their home were smoking in the snow. 5 of their children were gone. But the tragedy isn't what brings us here today. It's what happened next. At 10 a.m., the local fire chief finally arrived. At 12 p.m., just 2 hours later, he closed the investigation. 2 hours to sift through the debris of a 2-story home. 2 hours to determine the fate of 5 human beings. His verdict? Faulty wiring. His conclusion? The bodies were completely incinerated. But there is a massive problem with that story. It is not an emotional problem. It is a scientific one. To reduce a human skeleton to ash, to make bones disappear completely, you need a temperature of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. You need a crematorium, and you need to sustain that heat for 2 full hours. A house fire? It peaks at 1,500 degrees. It lasts 45 minutes before the roof collapses and smothers the flames. Physics dictates that there should have been bones, there should have been skulls, there should have been teeth. But in the ashes of the Sodder home, there was nothing. Physics does not lie, but people do. If the fire wasn't hot enough to melt them, where did they go? And why did everything go wrong that night? George tried to call for help, but the phone line was dead. The FBI said it burned through. A witness later found it cut with pliers at the top of the pole. George tried to use his ladder to save them. It was missing, found later in a ditch. He tried to start his coal trucks to climb up to the window. Both trucks, which worked perfectly the day before, refused to start. This was not an accident. This was a siege. They told George Sodder to accept the tragedy. They told him to stop asking questions. But accidents don't leave clues. Crimes do. Welcome to the file that physics couldn't explain and the FBI couldn't bury. You are now watching Case 1224.
To understand the anomaly, we must understand the night it happened. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The Sodder house was full of life. 9 children, 2 parents, and the anticipation of morning. The timeline begins with a warning. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jenny Sodder went downstairs to answer it. On the other end was a woman's voice she didn't know, asking for a name she didn't recognize. There was the sound of clinking glasses and laughter in the background. When Jenny said, "You have the wrong number," the woman laughed. A strange, sharp laugh that made Jenny's blood run cold. She hung up and returned to bed. She noticed something odd. The curtains were still open and the lights were still on. Half a number later, 1 a.m., Jenny heard a sound on the roof. Not reindeer. It was a loud bang, followed by a rolling noise, like a heavy rubber ball rolling down the shingles. Keep this detail in your mind. It becomes crucial later. At 1:30 a.m., she woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound. It was the smell of smoke. She rushed to George's study. The fuse box was sparking, but strangely, the Christmas lights in the living room were still on. Think about that. If the fire was caused by faulty wiring, as the fire chief claimed, why were the lights still working perfectly? An electrical fire kills the circuit first, but in the Sodder home, the lights stayed on, watching the fire grow. Panic took over. George and Jenny grabbed the 4 youngest children, Sylvia, Arnold, George Jr., and baby Marion, and ran out into the snow. They yelled for the children upstairs, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, but the staircase was already a wall of flame. This is where the accident theory falls apart. This is where it becomes a siege. George ran to the garage. He had 2 coal trucks. Both had been working perfectly the day before. He planned to drive one under the window and climb up to save his children. He turned the key, nothing. He tried the second truck, Nothing. Both engines were dead. He ran to the side of the house for his heavy extension ladder. It was always there, always. But that night, it was gone. Someone had moved it into a ditch 75 feet away. Without the ladder, without the trucks, and with his arms sliced open from breaking a window, George Sodder could do nothing. He watched his life burn. For 45 minutes, the fire raged, and then with a deafening crash, the roof collapsed into the basement. The screams, if there were any, stopped. By 2:30 a.m., it was over. The Sodder house was a pile of glowing ash. The family waited for morning, expecting to find remains. They expected the worst, but what they found in the daylight was scientifically impossible.
Christmas morning arrived, but the children did not. The sun rose over a smoking pit of basement rubble. George and Jenny waited for the firemen to rake through the ash. They prepared themselves to see the skulls, the vertebrae, the charred remains of their babies. But as the smoke cleared, there was nothing. No skulls, no bones, not even a tooth. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, told them to bury their grief. He said the fire was so hot it vaporized them. He issued 5 death certificates before the sun had even set. Case closed. But George Sodder was not just a grieving father. He was a smart man. He looked at the pile of rubble. He saw kitchen appliances that were twisted but still recognizable. He saw a metal dictionary stand that hadn't melted. And he asked the question that breaks this case wide open. If the fire couldn't even melt a tin roof, how did it vaporize 5 human skeletons? George couldn't sleep. The physics didn't make sense. So he turned his backyard into a laboratory. He bought chicken bones, he bought beef joints, he built fires and stoked them with coal, hotter than the house fire ever was. He burned them for hours, and every single time when the fire died down, the bones were still there. Black, brittle, but there. He contacted a local crematorium employee. The expert told him, "We burn bodies at 2,000 degrees for 2 hours, and even then we have to grind the remaining bones into powder." The Sodder house burned for 45 minutes. It was a wood and coal fire. It was physically impossible for those children to disappear, which meant only one thing. They were never in the house when it burned. Once George realized they might be alive, the witnesses started coming forward. A woman at a roadside diner claimed she served them breakfast the next morning. A bus driver claimed he saw balls of fire being thrown onto the roof, confirming the rolling sound Jenny heard. But the most chilling clue came from before the fire. Weeks earlier, an insurance salesman had visited the home. He got into an argument with George about politics. He pointed a finger at George and said, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." Was this a prediction, or was it a plan? The salesman was later part of the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident. The corruption was rotting from the inside out. 4 years later, in 1949, George forced a new excavation. He hired a pathologist from Washington, D.C., Oscar Hunter. They dug up the basement. They sifted every inch of dirt. They found a few small bone fragments, and they found a liver, a fresh, unburned liver. The fire chief claimed he found it in the ashes, but when the pathologist examined it, he found it had never been exposed to fire. It was a beef liver, a cow's liver, planted there by the fire chief to make the family think they found remains. The bone fragments? They were sent to the Smithsonian Institution. The report came back. These are lumbar vertebrae from a person aged 16 to 22. The oldest missing Sodder child was 14. The bones didn't belong to them. The FBI lied. The fire chief planted fake evidence, and 5 children were somewhere in the world, while their parents wept over a grave full of dirt. For the next 20 years, George and Jenny Sodder did not rest. They did not rebuild the house. Instead, they planted a garden of flowers over the ashes, a memorial to the lost, not the dead. And right next to the garden, on Route 19, they built a landmark that haunted West Virginia for decades, a massive billboard. It featured the black and white photos of the 5 children. It listed the anomalies. It offered a $5,000 reward. For years, cars would drive by, seeing those 5 faces staring out from the roadside, asking a question the FBI refused to answer. What was the fate of our children? George traveled across the country following leads. He chased rumors in St. Louis, in Texas, in Florida. Every time, he returned home empty-handed, but he never returned without hope. Then, in 1968, 23 years after the fire, hope arrived in the mail, but it arrived with a shadow. Jenny opened an envelope postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside, there was no letter, just a photograph. It was a grainy black and white picture of a young man in his mid-20s. He had dark hair, a strong jaw, and eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. On the back of the photo, a cryptic message was handwritten. Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. I lil boys, A90132. George and Jenny froze. The resemblance to their missing son, Lewis, was undeniable. The age matched, the nose matched, even the tilt of the left eyebrow matched. Was this Lewis? Was he trying to reach out? Or was this a cruel prank played on two dying parents?
They hired a private investigator to go to Kentucky. He took their money, and he vanished. They never heard from him again. The photo remained the last piece of the puzzle. George Sodder died a year later, in 1969. He died without knowing. He died with a broken heart, but an unbroken spirit. Jenny lived for another 20 years. She wore black every single day until her death in 1989. She tended the garden over the ashes. She kept the billboard standing until the day she couldn't anymore. The house is gone now. The billboard is gone. The parents are gone. But the file, case 1224, remains open.